They recognized him before he ever said a word. It started with a whisper, then a laugh. Someone nudged the person beside them and tilted their head slightly, like they had just spotted something amusing in the crowd. Phones came out not to record anything important, just curiosity, just ego. A few faces lit up with that look people get when they think they've figured someone out. Isn't that him? Yeah, that guy from the movies. Relax. He's just famous. The tone wasn't excited. It wasn't respectful, it was dismissive. Fame has a strange effect on people. To some, it looks like power. To others, it looks like a weakness they can poke at. He stood there quietly, dressed simply, blending in more than anyone expected. No entourage. No cameras following him. No dramatic presence. If you didn't know who he was, you might have thought he was just another man passing through his day. That's what made it easy. Easy to underestimate him. Easy to assume. Easy to forget that calm doesn't mean fragile. One man scoffed out loud. Another smirked and shook his head. Crazy how these celebrities act tough on screen. Someone muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Yeah. Another replied. Real life is different. A few people laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because laughter feels safer when you're trying to feel superior. He noticed everything. The looks. The tone. The shift in energy around him. But he didn't react. He didn't straighten his posture to look intimidating. He didn't say a word to correct anyone. He didn't try to remind them who he was. He simply stood there, breathing evenly, eyes calm. That calm made some people uncomfortable. Because when someone doesn't respond the way you expect, it forces you to question your assumptions. And not everyone likes that feeling. One voice got bolder. Another stepped a little closer than necessary. Still nothing. No anger, no fear, no performance. Just silence. To the onlookers, that silence looked like hesitation. To the mockers, it looked like weakness. To the men watching closely, it looked like an invitation. They thought fame had softened him. They thought cameras and applause had replaced discipline. They thought a name people recognized was easier to test. They were wrong. Very wrong. Because what they didn't understand, what almost no one ever does, is that real strength doesn't announce itself. It waits. And when the moment comes, it doesn't need to prove anything. It simply acts. And in just a few seconds, the laughter that filled the air would disappear completely, replaced by a silence far heavier than before. The kind of silence that makes people realize they misjudged the wrong man. It was an ordinary place on an ordinary day. The kind of location people forget the moment they leave it. Footsteps echoed against concrete. A steady hum of traffic passed nearby. Conversations overlapped, half-finished sentences, complaints about the heat, plans for later that night. Everyone was moving with purpose, even if they didn't quite know what that purpose was. In places like this, nobody expects anything unusual to happen. That's why assumptions feel so safe. He stood off to the side, not trying to draw attention, not hiding either. Just present. His posture was relaxed, shoulders loose, hands at his sides. The kind of body language that doesn't demand space, but somehow keeps it. People walked past him without slowing down. Some glanced at his face and did a double take, eyes narrowing as recognition tried to catch up. Others didn't notice him at all. They were too busy staring at their phones, too focused on their own timelines and notifications. Recognition came in waves. First curiosity, then confidence, then disrespect. Once a few people decided they knew exactly who he was, the mood shifted. It always does. Fame invites opinions from strangers who've never spoken to you, never stood where you stand, never lived the discipline behind the image. He looks smaller in real life. Someone said quietly, movies can make anyone look tough. Another replied, those words weren't meant for him, but they were close enough. Still, he didn't react. He had been in louder rooms, tenser moments, places where the stakes were far higher than embarrassment or ego. This wasn't new to him. What was new, what always surprised people, was how little interest he had in correcting them. No defensive smile, no forced laugh, no attempt to play along. He watched, he listened. Across the space, a small group lingered longer than necessary. They weren't just passing by. They were waiting, testing the moment, seeing how far familiarity could stretch before it snapped. One of them nudged another, eyes flicking in his direction. Bet he wouldn't last 5 seconds without a stunt double. That earned a laugh. Laughter like that doesn't come from confidence. It comes from wanting to be seen. The crowd shifted subtly. People slowed down. Some sensed tension even if they couldn't explain it. Others were just drawn by the possibility of drama. Like moths to a flame they swear they're not interested in. He remained still, His face showed nothing, no irritation, no challenge, just awareness. The kind that comes from years of understanding how quickly situations can change when pride enters the room. One man stepped closer than before, not aggressively. Not yet. Just close enough to invade personal space. Close enough to see if he would flinch. He didn't. That unsettled them more than anger ever could. When someone expects a reaction and doesn't get one, their next move is usually louder, bolder, less thoughtful. They mistake restraint for fear and patience for hesitation. Someone nearby whispered, "Is he going to say something?" Another replied,
Nah.
"He won't do anything. He can't." Can't. That word hung in the air. Because to them, fame came with rules, with limitations, with an unspoken belief that consequences would keep him still. They assumed cameras were shields. They assumed attention was a leash. They assumed a public place meant safety for them. What they didn't see was the quiet calculation happening behind calm eyes, not planning violence, not looking for trouble, just recognizing that the line, the invisible one people pretend doesn't exist, was getting very close to being crossed. And when that line disappears, everything changes. The street was still busy, people were still walking, life was still moving, but something had shifted. The setup was complete. And whether they realized it or not, they were no longer in control of the moment. The moment didn't explode. It tightened, like a room losing air slowly, almost politely, until everyone inside realizes they're breathing differently. One of the men laughed again, louder this time. Not because something was funny, but because silence was starting to feel uncomfortable. He tilted his head, eyes scanning the small crowd that had begun to form, enjoying the attention. "Simon," he said casually, "you're telling me that's him?" He said it like a challenge, like an invitation. Another man stepped closer, close enough now that personal space was no longer a suggestion, it was a test. He smelled faintly of cologne and confidence, the kind that comes from never being corrected. Stephen didn't move. He didn't step back. He didn't step forward. He simply looked at the man, not with anger, not with threat, with something worse, understanding. That look unsettled him. "You good?" the man asked, half smiling, half mocking. "You look lost." A few people laughed again, nervous this time. The kind of laughter that asks, should we really be watching this? But keeps watching anyway. Stephen's expression didn't change. That's when the first shove happened. Not hard, not violent. Just enough to say, "I'm not afraid of you." The sound of the shove was soft, fabric brushing fabric, but it echoed louder than anyone expected. Conversations nearby trailed off. Footsteps slowed. A couple of phones lifted higher, framing the scene more carefully now. Still, Stephen didn't react. No raised voice, no sharp movement. Just stillness. And that stillness confused them. Because most people respond immediately, with anger, with fear, with excuses. When none of those appeared, the man who shoved him felt exposed, like he had shouted into a canyon and heard nothing back. So he talked. "That's what I thought," he said, turning slightly to the others. "All talk on screen. Real life. Different story." The group murmured in agreement. They mistook restraint for surrender. Stephen finally spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be heard. "Step back." 2 words. Calm, measured. The man laughed again, but it came out thinner this time. Or what? That question hung in the air. And for a brief moment, a very brief moment, everything stopped. Cars still passed in the distance. A siren wailed somewhere far away. But in that small circle of people, time felt suspended. The man took another half step forward. That was it. Not because Stephen was angry, not because he wanted to prove anything, but because the line had been crossed. The change was immediate, not explosive, controlled. 1 second, the man was standing too close, smirking. The next, his balance was gone. No wild swing, no dramatic wind up. Just a precise movement, efficient, almost clinical. Stephen shifted his weight, redirected the force, and in a blink, the man was no longer standing where he thought he was. The sound that followed wasn't a punch. It was surprise, a sharp intake of breath, a stagger, a sudden understanding that something had gone very wrong. Phones froze mid-record. Someone gasped. Another man reached forward instinctively, then stopped himself, unsure of what he was seeing. Because what he saw didn't match the story in his head. This wasn't a celebrity losing control. This wasn't a fight. This was discipline revealing itself. Stephen stepped back immediately. No follow-through, no aggression. He didn't pursue. He didn't posture. He simply created space again, exactly as it had been moments before. The man stumbled, catching himself, eyes wide now, not with pain, but with shock. The kind that hits when reality contradicts ego. The laughter was gone, completely. In its place was silence, heavy, thick, undeniable. People looked at each other, then back at Stephen, reassessing everything they thought they knew. The whispers stopped. Even the phones felt intrusive now, their glowing screens suddenly inappropriate. Stephen's voice came again, calm as before. "I asked you to step back." No threat, no insult. Just a statement of fact. The man didn't respond. He couldn't. Because in that moment, he understood something too late. That fame hadn't made Stephen weaker. It had simply hidden the strength from people who were careless enough to look for it. Have you ever seen someone mistake patience for weakness? For a few seconds, no one moved. Not the man who had stepped out of line, not his friends, not the people holding their phones mid-air, unsure whether to keep recording or put them away. The air felt heavier than before, like the street itself had paused to process what had just happened. The man who stumbled back straightened slowly. His face had changed, not bruised, not angry, just stripped of certainty. The smirk was gone. In its place was something far less comfortable, awareness. He took a step back this time, not because he was told to, but because he finally understood. A woman near the edge of the crowd covered her mouth, eyes wide. Someone else whispered, "Did you see that?" But the words sounded unnecessary. Everyone had seen it. More importantly, everyone had felt it. This wasn't chaos, it wasn't violence, it was control. And that distinction mattered. Stephen stood exactly where he had been before. His breathing was steady, his posture unchanged. If someone had looked away for a second and back again, they might have thought nothing happened at all. That's what unsettled people the most. Most confrontations leave marks, raised voices, frantic movements, adrenaline spilling into the open. This left none of that, just silence and a sudden shift in how everyone in the area perceived one man. A few phones slowly lowered. Recording no longer felt fun. It felt invasive. One of the men from the group cleared his throat, trying to laugh it off, but the sound came out wrong, too loud. Too forced. He glanced around, searching for reassurance, but found none. No one laughed with him. The crowd wasn't impressed in the way they expected to be impressed. There were no cheers, no applause. Just quiet respect mixed with discomfort. Because moments like this don't entertain, they expose. A passerby muttered, "That wasn't acting." Another shook their head slowly, eyes never leaving Stephen. The man who had crossed the line avoided eye contact now. His shoulders tightened, his stance less sure. He took another step back, then another, increasing the distance he had tried so hard to erase moments earlier. Stephen didn't watch him retreat. He wasn't interested in dominance. He simply turned slightly, checking the space around him, making sure no one else felt threatened. No one else felt the need to test something that didn't need testing. That alone changed the mood. The tension that had been coiled and ready snapped, not into chaos but into clarity. People realized they weren't watching a scene. They were witnessing restraint. A father nearby pulled his teenage son a little closer, not out of fear, but as if to say, "Pay attention. This is important." The son nodded, eyes fixed forward. Someone else finally broke the silence softly this time. He asked him to step back. The words weren't said as commentary. They were said like an explanation, as if everyone needed reminding that none of this had been necessary. The group that had laughed earlier began to disperse, not all at once. One by one, slowly, without drawing attention. Each step away felt deliberate, like an unspoken agreement to let the moment end. Stephen didn't follow them with his eyes. He didn't need to. He adjusted his jacket, a small, ordinary movement that somehow grounded the entire scene back in reality. That simple gesture said more than words ever could. This is over. A woman who had been filming slipped her phone into her bag, cheeks flushed. Another person turned away, suddenly very interested in crossing the street. Life began to move again. Cars passed, footsteps resumed, conversations restarted, though quieter now, more thoughtful. But the energy had changed. People who remained looked at Stephen differently, not with excitement, not with fear, but with a kind of subdued respect that doesn't ask for selfies or autographs. One man nodded at him as he walked past. Stephen returned the nod, just as casually, no acknowledgement of what happened, no invitation to discuss it. The man who had caused it all lingered at the edge of the scene, rubbing his hands together, replaying the moment in his head. Not the movement, but the calm. That was what stayed with him. Because strength like that doesn't humiliate you, it educates you. Stephen took a step forward, then another, blending back into the flow of the street. People made space for him now instinctively, without realizing they were doing it, not out of fear, out of understanding. Behind him, the crowd slowly dissolved, each person carrying a different version of the same realization. They hadn't just seen someone prove others wrong. They had seen what happens when ego meets discipline and loses without noise. It didn't happen with a shout. There was no announcement, no dramatic pause designed for attention. The realization arrived quietly, moving through the crowd like a ripple through still water. Someone near the back leaned toward a friend and whispered, almost unsure of their own voice, "Do you know who that actually is?" The friend frowned. "What do you mean?" "That's not just some guy," the voice continued. "That's Steven Seagal." The name didn't explode, it settled. A few heads turned sharply, others froze mid-step. Steven Seagal. The words carried weight now, not because of fame, but because they suddenly explained everything that had just happened. The calm, the control, the complete absence of panic. Another whisper followed. "Wait, that's Steven Seagal? The martial artist? The real one?" Phones came back out, not to mock this time, but to confirm. Screens filled with search results images, clips from old interviews, slow motion scenes people suddenly remembered with new context. The energy shifted again, not into chaos, into clarity. The men who had laughed earlier exchanged glances, the kind of glances that don't need words. Regret mixed with disbelief. One of them exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "So it wasn't an act," he muttered. The man who had crossed the line finally spoke, his voice low, stripped of bravado. "I didn't know." He trailed off. Steven turned slightly, not confrontational, not dismissive. He looked at the man the same way he had looked before everything happened. Calm, neutral, unimpressed. "I know," Steven said. 2 words again, not sharp, not smug, just honest, because it was never about recognition. The crowd watched closely now, waiting to see what fame would do to the moment. Would he lecture them? Would he claim the spotlight? Would he remind them who he was? He did none of it. Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain himself. He didn't even fully face the crowd. Instead, he spoke quietly, almost conversationally. "People forget," he said. "That discipline doesn't disappear when cameras turn on." No applause followed. Not because the line wasn't powerful, but because everyone knew applause would cheapen it. Someone nodded slowly. Another lowered their head. The man who had shoved him swallowed hard, shame creeping up his neck. "I thought," he started, then stopped. There was no sentence that could finish the thought without sounding foolish. Steven didn't let him struggle. "It happens," he said simply. That was the reveal. Not the name, not the reputation, not the realization that he was famous. The reveal was understanding. Understanding that fame hadn't protected Steven. It hadn't softened him. It hadn't replaced years of discipline, restraint, and control. It had simply made people forget those things were ever there. A woman near the storefront whispered to her friend. Her could have embarrassed them. Her friend nodded. But he didn't. That mattered. Because real strength doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need proof. And it never needs to humiliate. The group began to drift away again, this time more quietly, more respectfully. The man who caused the scene gave one final glance, part apology, part gratitude, before turning and walking off without another word. Steven didn't watch him leave. He wasn't interested in aftermaths. Someone finally spoke up from the crowd, hesitant but sincere. "Sir, I just want to say," Steven lifted a hand gently, stopping them before the sentence could turn into praise. "It's all right," he said, and just like that, the moment ended. No signatures, no photos, no speech about respect or lessons learned. He adjusted his jacket once more and took a step forward, already moving past the space where everything had unfolded. The crowd parted naturally this time. Not because they were afraid, because they understood. Behind him, people stood quieter than before, each replaying the same thought in their own way. They hadn't just mistaken fame for weakness. They had mistaken silence for softness. And now they knew the difference. Steven walked away the same way he had been standing moments earlier. Quietly, unrushed, unchanged. No one followed him. Not because they were told not to, but because something about the way he left made it clear the moment was finished. Chasing it would only cheapen what had just happened. Footsteps resumed around him, but people instinctively gave him space. Not wide, exaggerated distance, just enough. The kind you give someone you finally understand. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Behind him, the street slowly returned to normal, though it didn't feel the same. Conversations picked up again, but they were softer now. Less joking, less careless. As if everyone had collectively agreed to lower their voices, out of respect for something they couldn't quite name. The man who had crossed the line stood still for a long moment after Stephen left. His friends waited a few steps away, unsure what to say, unsure whether to comfort him or distance themselves from the embarrassment still hanging in the air. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a long breath. "That wasn't how I thought that would go," he said quietly. No one answered, because everyone knew what he meant. He hadn't expected consequences. He hadn't expected restraint. He hadn't expected to feel small without being humiliated. That feeling stayed with him. Across the street, a woman leaned against a wall, replaying the scene in her head. Not the movement, but the moment before it. The calm request, the patience, the choice to act only when necessary. "That's what control looks like," she murmured to herself. A man nearby overheard and nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Most people never learn it." Life continued. Cars honked. A door opened and closed. Someone laughed again, but this time it was genuine, disconnected from ego. Stephen blended back into the crowd, another face among many. Though now the space around him seemed to move with him rather than against him. People passed without staring, without pointing, without whispering. That was exactly how he preferred it. He hadn't come to make a point. He hadn't come to teach a lesson. He had simply responded to the moment as it demanded. And that response, measured, restrained, precise, had done more than shouting ever could. The street eventually forgot the details. Stories blurred. People disagreed about exactly what they saw, but one thing stayed consistent in every retelling. He didn't lose control. It didn't show off. He just handled it. That stuck. Because in a world where attention is currency, choosing not to seek it feels almost rebellious. The group that had laughed first scattered in different directions, each carrying their own version of the moment. Some felt embarrassed. Some felt educated. One felt grateful it hadn't gone worse. And one, the man who had crossed the line, felt changed. Not broken, not humiliated, changed. He would remember that feeling the next time he mistook silence for weakness. The next time he thought calm meant harmless. The next time he felt tempted to test someone just to prove something to himself. Stephen never heard that thought. He didn't need to, because true resolution doesn't require acknowledgement. It doesn't need apologies. It doesn't demand validation. It happens quietly inside people, long after the moment itself has passed. Stephen reached the end of the block and paused briefly, waiting for the signal to change. He stood there like anyone else, hands relaxed, gaze forward, completely ordinary. The light changed. He crossed the street and disappeared into the flow of the city. No applause followed him, no crowd formed behind him. Just a few people standing where it all began, aware that they had witnessed something rare. Not a fight, not a celebrity moment, but a reminder that real strength doesn't announce itself. It resolves the moment and moves on. Would you have stayed calm or reacted immediately? Long after Steven Seagal disappeared into the moving city, the street kept going. That's how moments like this usually end, not with a dramatic fade out, not with a clear conclusion, but with life continuing as if nothing special happened. People crossed the same sidewalk. Cars passed the same corner. The store doors opened and closed like they had all day. And yet, something had happened. It just didn't look like what people are used to calling a moment. There was no winner standing over a loser, no crowd celebrating, no viral speech meant to be clipped and shared. What lingered instead was quieter and far more uncomfortable. Awareness. People replayed it in their minds as they walked away, each version slightly different, but all circling the same core truth. Some focused on the movement, others on the calm beforehand, others still on the way Stephen had walked off without looking back. But the more they thought about it, the more they realized the most powerful part of what they witnessed wasn't physical at all. It was restraint. In a world that rewards loudness, restraint feels invisible. In a culture that celebrates reaction, control looks boring. In a time where attention is currency, humility looks like weakness, until it isn't. One man, walking 3 blocks away, suddenly slowed down. He hadn't been part of the confrontation. He hadn't laughed or mocked. He had just watched. And yet, something about the scene had unsettled him. He thought about how many times he had raised his voice just to feel heard. How often he had mistaken dominance for confidence. How quickly he reacted when someone crossed him even slightly. He shook his head. "That's not strength," he muttered. "That's insecurity." The realization surprised him. Across town, a woman told her friend about what she'd seen, struggling to explain why it mattered so much. "It wasn't a fight," she said. "That's the thing." It was like a reminder. A reminder of what? Her friend asked. She thought for a moment. That power doesn't need permission, she said slowly. And it doesn't need approval either. Those words stayed with her. Because most people spend their lives chasing one of two things: recognition or control. And often, they confuse the two. They believe being seen is the same as being respected. They believe being loud is the same as being strong. Stephen's presence had challenged that belief without arguing against it. He hadn't corrected anyone. He hadn't defended his reputation. He hadn't explained his past. He let his behavior speak, and then he removed himself from the story entirely. That's what made it uncomfortable. Because when someone doesn't need your validation, it forces you to question how much you need theirs. The man who had crossed the line sat later that evening on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. The embarrassment had faded, but the clarity hadn't. He replayed the moment again and again, not the stumble, not the looks from the crowd, but the calm request he had ignored: step back. He realized something then that stung far more than public embarrassment ever could. If he had stepped back, nothing would have happened. No one had forced him. No one had threatened him. No one had disrespected him first. His ego had done that. An ego, he now understood, is loud because it's afraid. Stephen's calm had exposed that fear without naming it. That was the lesson. Not that Stephen was dangerous. Not that fame doesn't mean weakness. But that discipline, real discipline, removes the need to prove anything at all. This is where most stories would end with a quote. A clean line. Something neat and inspirational. But real lessons don't arrive neatly packaged. They arrive quietly, and they sit with you. They show up the next time someone cuts you off in traffic. The next time someone disrespects you in public. The next time you feel the urge to react just to reclaim your pride. And in that moment, you remember. You remember the calm. You remember the restraint. You remember that real power doesn't escalate, it resolves. Stephen never intended to teach anyone that day. That's important. Because the most powerful lessons are rarely taught on purpose. They're demonstrated when someone stays true to who they are, regardless of who's watching. Think about how often people change when they realize they're being observed. They exaggerate, they perform, they harden. Stephen did the opposite. He stayed exactly the same. That consistency, that refusal to become something else for the moment, is what separates true strength from situational dominance. Dominance needs a stage. Strength does not. Dominance needs validation. Strength is self-contained. Dominance escalates. Strength waits. And when strength finally acts, it does so without anger, without ego, without noise. That's why the moment ended the way it did. No chaos, no revenge, no humiliation, just resolution. People often ask what real confidence looks like. It doesn't look like shouting. It doesn't look like posturing. It doesn't look like winning arguments. It looks like being able to walk away without needing the last word. Stephen walked away. And that, more than anything else, is what people remembered. Weeks later, someone would bring it up in a conversation, half forgetting the details but remembering the feeling. I saw this guy once, they'd say. Everyone thought he was weak. Turns out he wasn't, and he didn't even need to show it. The story would change slightly each time, but the core would remain, because humility, when paired with discipline, is impossible to ignore. This isn't a story about a celebrity. It's a story about perception, about how quickly we judge, how easily we assume, how confidently we underestimate what we don't understand. And it's a reminder that the people who scare you the least at first glance are often the ones who've already mastered themselves. If there's one thing to take away from this, it's this. You don't need to announce your strength. You don't need to advertise your ability. You don't need to react to every challenge. The strongest people in the room are usually the quietest, not because they lack power, but because they don't need to use it. So here's a simple question for you. When you're tested, do you react or do you respond? There's a difference. Reaction is automatic. Response is intentional. Reaction feeds the ego. Response reflects control. Stephen responded, and then he left. No lesson delivered out loud, no applause earned, no moment claimed. Just a quiet reminder left behind for anyone paying attention. True strength isn't loud. It doesn't look down on others, and it never needs to prove itself. If you believe humility is real power, type respect in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one.